The meteorologist's voice cracked through the static of Sarah Chen's old radio, words that would change everything. Unprecedented polar vortex, temperatures plunging to -40, possibly the worst blizzard in 60 years. Sarah stood in her workshop, calloused hands still gripping the wrench she'd been using. Outside her Montana property, the November sky had turned an ominous shade of gray-green, the kind of color that made animals go silent. She'd seen bad winters before. 20 years of homesteading had taught her to read the land's warnings. But something about this felt different. Her neighbors thought she was paranoid. When she'd started digging the shelter 2 years ago, they'd laughed over beers at Morrison's bar. Sarah's building her bunker, they'd joke. What's she preparing for, the apocalypse? But Sarah knew something they didn't. She'd studied her great-grandmother's journals from the winter of 1949, the last time a storm this severe had hit the region. Entire families had frozen in their homes when the power failed. She walked to the window and watched the first snowflakes begin to fall. They were large and heavy, dropping straight down without the usual dancing drift. The chickens had already huddled into their coop hours earlier than normal. Even Rex, her usually fearless German shepherd, had been whining at the door since dawn. Sarah made her decision. She had 72 hours, maybe less. It was time to put 2 years of planning to the test. Sarah's shelter wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a precisely engineered thermal battery that would harness the Earth's constant temperature. The concept had come to her during a visit to the ancient underground cities of Cappadocia, Turkey. There, she'd marveled at how chambers carved into volcanic rock maintained comfortable temperatures year-round without any modern heating. The principle was simple but profound. Below the frost line, roughly 8 feet deep in Montana, the Earth maintained a constant temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of the surface conditions. But Sarah needed warmer than 55 degrees. She needed 85. Her design incorporated 3 key innovations. First, she dug down 12 feet, well below the frost line, creating a 400-square-foot main chamber with an arched ceiling for structural integrity. The curved walls would distribute earth pressure evenly, preventing collapse even under tons of snow. Second, she'd installed a double-walled construction system. The outer wall was made of reinforced concrete, while the inner wall consisted of compressed earth blocks she'd made herself. Between them ran a 6-inch gap filled with a mixture of perlite and lime, a breathable insulation that would wick away any moisture while maintaining thermal mass. The third innovation was the most crucial, a passive geothermal loop. She'd buried 300 feet of PX tubing in a serpentine pattern beneath the shelter's floor, running through a bed of sand and gravel. Gravity-fed water from her well would slowly circulate through these tubes, absorbing the Earth's constant warmth before rising through copper coils that radiated heat into the living space. But the system needed one more element to reach 85 degrees, her own body heat, combined with strategic thermal mass storage. Sarah had lined the walls with water-filled barrels and clay bricks that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. In a sealed, well-insulated space, even the 100 watts of heat from a human body would make a significant difference. She'd sketched it all out in her notebooks, done the calculations 100 times. On paper, it would work. Now she needed to prove it could save her life. The temperature had already dropped 15 degrees in 6 hours. Sarah worked with mechanical precision, checking items off her list. First, water. She hauled 5-gallon containers from the well, filling every vessel in the shelter, the thermal mass barrels, drinking storage, and the geothermal loop system. The well pump ran on electricity, and once the power failed, it would be useless. She filled 20 gallons for drinking, 40 more for the heating system. Second, food. She'd been stockpiling for months, but now she did a final inventory. Dried beans, rice, canned vegetables, jerky she'd made from last fall's deer. High-calorie foods that would help her body generate heat. She calculated 14 days of supplies, twice what the Weather Service predicted for the storm's duration. Third, backup systems. She tested the battery bank connected to her solar panels one last time. Even if snow covered the panels, she'd have LED lighting for 2 weeks minimum. She checked her hand crank radio, her chemical light sticks, her first aid supplies. Her phone buzzed. A text from her brother in Seattle. News says Montana's getting hit hard. You okay? Sarah smiled grimly as she typed her response. Going dark for a while. Underground. I'll call when it's over. By sunset, the wind had picked up. It screamed around the house with a sound like tearing metal. Sarah took one last look at her home. The cabin her grandfather had built in 1952, sturdy, but never meant for what was coming. She grabbed her go bag and Rex's leash. The entrance to her shelter was 30 yards from the house, disguised as a small tool shed. Inside the shed, a reinforced hatch opened to stairs descending into the earth. Sarah climbed down, Rex following close behind. At the bottom, she sealed the upper hatch, then closed the interior insulated door. The silence was immediate and absolute. No wind, no creaking boards, no rattling windows. Just the steady drip of water into the thermal barrels and Rex's breathing beside her. Sarah checked her thermometer. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The shelter was at ambient earth temperature. She fired up the geothermal circulation pump, a small, low-wattage device that would help speed the water flow through the ground loops. Then she lit 2 small candles, not for light, but for their 150 watts of heat output. And then she waited. Above ground, hell had frozen over. Sarah couldn't see it, but she could hear it, a muffled roar that penetrated even 12 feet of earth and concrete. The blizzard hit with full force at 2 a.m. She sat on her cot, monitoring her instruments by LED light, logging data in her notebook every hour. Hour 1, 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 3, 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 6, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 12, 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature was rising, slowly but steadily. The geothermal loops were working. The water circulating beneath the floor absorbed the Earth's constant warmth, while the copper coils radiated it into the living space. The thermal mass in the walls, those water-filled barrels and clay bricks, were charging up, storing heat for when she'd need it most. But outside, according to the weather reports crackling through her hand-crank radio, conditions had become apocalyptic. Wind chills of -70, snow falling at 4 inches per hour, power lines down across 3 counties. Emergency services suspended. It was too dangerous for rescue vehicles to operate. Sarah thought about her neighbors. The Johnsons in their modern ranch house with electric heating. Old Pete Morrison above his bar with only a wood stove. The Martinez family in their double-wide trailer. Were they okay? Had they evacuated? Or were they huddling under blankets, burning furniture in their fireplaces, watching their breath cloud in rooms that grew colder by the hour? She pushed the thoughts away. She couldn't help them now. All she could do was survive and document what worked. Hour 18, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 24, 71 degrees Fahrenheit. Rex slept on his bed in the corner, unconcerned. Sarah ate a meal of reheated stew from a jar. She'd cooked it on the surface days ago, and the thermal mass of the glass kept it warm. She did stretches and bodyweight exercises, generating heat and preventing the stiffness that came from the confined space. Hour 36, 76 degrees Fahrenheit. Hour 48, 79 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm raged on. Sarah's radio picked up fragmented reports. National Guard mobilized. Highway 93 buried under 12-foot drifts. Temperatures still dropping. Hour 60, 82 degrees Fahrenheit. She was close. So close. Hour 72, 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah stared at the thermometer in disbelief, then checked it against her backup. Both read the same. 85 degrees Fahrenheit. In a space 12 feet underground, with no furnace, no electricity beyond LED lights, no modern heating system. Just earth, water, insulation, and physics. She'd done it. On the 7th day, the radio announced the storm was breaking. Sarah climbed the stairs to her upper hatch and tried to open it. It wouldn't budge. She wasn't surprised. Snow had likely drifted over the shed entrance, maybe 6 feet deep or more. She'd planned for this. She retrieved her collapsible shovel and returned to the hatch. It took an hour of careful work, breaking through the compacted snow in chunks, before she finally felt the resistance give way. Blinding white light flooded down the stairwell. Sarah climbed up into a transformed world. The snow came up to her chest, nearly 4 feet of accumulation. Her house was barely visible, just the peak of the roof showing above the drifts. Icicles as thick as her arm hung from every surface. But the sky was clear and painfully blue. The storm had passed. She waded through the snow to her house and forced open the door. Inside, her thermometer read 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The pipes had burst. Ice crystals coated the windows from the inside. If she'd stayed here, she would have frozen. Over the next week, as the National Guard dug out the county and power crews worked to restore electricity, the stories emerged. 3 people had died in the storm, including Pete Morrison, who'd run out of firewood on the 4th day. The Johnsons had been rescued by helicopter with severe frostbite. Dozens more had been hospitalized for hypothermia. But Sarah had been comfortable. More than comfortable. She maintained a constant 85 degrees Fahrenheit for 7 days straight. She'd read books by LED light, done yoga, cooked meals on her small camping stove. Rats had been so warm he'd actually panted a few times. When the news crews finally made it to her property, they couldn't believe it. She showed them her shelter, explained her design, shared her temperature logs. The footage went viral. Montana woman survives historic blizzard in underground shelter she built herself. The calls started coming. Engineers wanting to study her design. Preppers wanting to replicate it. Universities requesting interviews. FEMA asking if she'd consult on emergency shelter specifications. Sarah answered them all the same way. I didn't invent anything new. I just remembered what people used to know, that the earth is the best insulator we have. You don't fight nature. You work with it. She stood at her window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, and thought about her great-grandmother who'd survived the winter of 1949. She wished the old woman could see this, could know that her journals had saved a life 60 years later. The shelter had proven itself, not just as a survival space, but as a reminder that the simplest solutions, earth, water, gravity, physics, were often the most reliable. Sarah smiled and turned back to her drawing board. She already had ideas for improvements to the design. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Sarah's property looked like a parking lot. News vans, university vehicles, and trucks belonging to curious engineers lined her driveway. She'd agreed to host what she called the Underground Open House, one day where anyone genuinely interested in the shelter design could come see it for themselves. Dr. Marcus Webb from Montana State University arrived first, accompanied by 2 graduate students carrying surveying equipment. He was a thermodynamics specialist who'd spent 20 years studying passive heating systems in extreme climates. Ms. Chen, he said, shaking her hand firmly, I've reviewed your temperature logs. Frankly, they shouldn't be possible. The thermal efficiency you achieved exceeds anything I've seen in modern geothermal systems. Sarah led him down into the shelter. He spent 2 hours taking measurements, examining the insulation gaps, studying the geothermal loop configuration. His students documented everything with cameras and laser measuring tools. The genius isn't the layering, Dr. Webb muttered, more to himself than anyone else. You've created multiple thermal zones. The Earth provides the baseline constant temperature. The geothermal loop elevates it. The thermal mass stores it. And the superior insulation prevents any loss. It's brilliant in its simplicity. Next came the preppers, a group of 5 families from across the state who'd been following Sarah's story online. They had practical questions. How much did it cost? How long did it take to build? Could it be scaled up for a family of 6? Sarah walked them through every detail. The shelter had cost approximately $8,000 in materials: concrete, insulation, PX tubing, the copper coils, and miscellaneous supplies. She'd done all the labor herself over 18 months, working weekends and evenings. The excavation alone had taken 4 months with a rented backhoe. Could you build it cheaper? Asked Tom Rivera, a father of 3 from Billings. Absolutely, Sarah replied. I over-engineered some aspects because I was learning as I went. Someone following my refined plans could probably do it for $5,000, maybe less if you source reclaimed materials. The questions continued. What about ventilation? Sarah showed them her air intake and exhaust pipes, positioned to create natural convection flow. The intake drew fresh air from above ground, while the exhaust released stale air through a separate pipe with a one-way valve to prevent backdraft. What about moisture? She explained her vapor barrier system and a breathable lime perlite insulation that allowed any moisture to migrate outward into the surrounding earth rather than condensing inside. What about carbon dioxide buildup? Rex the dog had been her canary in the coal mine. If he'd shown any signs of distress, she would have known the ventilation was inadequate. But the air exchange system she designed handled 2 occupants easily. By afternoon, a FEMA regional coordinator named Janet Kowalski arrived. She was all business, clipboard in hand. Ms. Chen, we're updating our emergency shelter recommendations for rural areas. Your design could save lives. Would you be willing to let us publish your plans? Sarah hesitated. She'd built this shelter for herself, tested it with her own life. The idea of it becoming public felt strange, almost invasive. But then she thought of Pete Morrison, of the others who died, of families huddling in freezing homes during the next inevitable disaster. Yes, she said, on one condition, the plans stay open source, free for anyone to use. No patents, no profiteering. This is survival, not business. Janet smiled. I think we can arrange that. Dr. Webb returned a week later with a proposal. He wanted to instrument the shelter with sensors and data loggers to study its thermal performance over an entire year. In exchange, he'd help Sarah optimize the design and document everything in a peer-reviewed paper. This isn't just about survival shelters, he explained as they sat in Sarah's kitchen drinking coffee. The principles you've applied here could revolutionize how we think about sustainable housing in extreme climates. No fossil fuels, minimal electricity, using the earth itself as a thermal battery. Do you understand how significant that is? Sarah did, actually. She'd spent months researching before breaking ground. She'd studied ancient building techniques from Iceland to Afghanistan, all places where humans had learned to survive brutal climates with limited resources. The Native Americans who lived here before us knew this, she said. Their earth lodges maintained comfortable temperatures year-round. We just forgot. Over the next month, Dr. Webb's team installed sensors throughout the shelter. Temperature probes at various depths in the walls, flow meters in the geothermal loops, humidity sensors, even infrared cameras to map heat distribution. The data they collected was extraordinary. The shelter's internal temperature varied by less than 3 degrees over a 24-hour period, demonstrating incredible thermal stability. The geothermal loops maintained a constant flow temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit coming in from the Earth and 68 degrees Fahrenheit returning after circulating through the living space. Most impressive was the coefficient of performance, the ratio of heat energy delivered to energy consumed. Sarah's passive system achieved a COP of approximately 15, meaning she got 15 units of heat for every 1 unit of energy used to run the small circulation pump. Modern heat pumps typically achieve COPs of 3 to 4. You're essentially getting free heat, Dr. Webb said, showing her the graphs. The Earth is giving you 52 degrees for nothing. Your insulation keeps it from escaping. The thermal mass smooths out any fluctuations, and your own body heat, plus minimal supplemental heating, brings it up to comfortable levels. The system is nearly perfect, but Sarah was more interested in the weaknesses. Where can I improve it? Dr. Webb pulled out his tablet and brought up thermal imaging scans. Here, he pointed to an area near the entrance stairs. You're losing some heat through the hatch system. A secondary airlock would help. And here, at the ventilation intake, you could add a heat recovery ventilator that pre-warms incoming air using the exhaust air. They spent hours discussing modifications. Sarah took notes, sketched improvements, calculated material costs. She was already planning Shelter 2.0 in her mind. There's something else, Dr. Webb said carefully. We've run the numbers on scaling this up. A shelter like this could comfortably house a family of 4 to 6 people. The thermal mass would actually work better with more body heat, and the cost per person would drop significantly. Sarah looked out her window at the Montana landscape, still snow-covered in early March. How many families out there were one disaster away from catastrophe? How many could benefit from this knowledge? Let's document everything, she said. Every measurement, every calculation, every lesson learned. Make it so clear that anyone with basic construction skills could build one. Dr. Webb nodded. I'll need you to co-author the paper. I'm not a scientist. No, but you're an engineer in the truest sense of the word. You identified a problem, designed a solution, and tested it under the most extreme conditions possible. That's science, Sarah. That's exactly what science is. By late spring, Sarah's inbox was flooded with photos. People from across Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, even Alaska and Canada, had started building their own versions of her shelter. Some were faithful reproductions, following her published plans exactly. Others were creative adaptations. A family in Saskatchewan had built theirs into a hillside to reduce excavation. A retired couple in North Dakota had integrated their shelter with a root cellar for year-round food storage. A group in Alaska had scaled it up to create a community shelter for their village of 40 people. But not all the news was good. A man in Idaho sent photos of his failed attempt. He'd skipped the vapor barrier to save money, and now the interior walls were covered in condensation and mold. A family in Wyoming had miscalculated their ventilation needs and experienced dangerous carbon dioxide buildup. Another builder had placed the air intake too close to ground level, and it had clogged with snow during a storm. Sarah felt responsible. These were her plans, her design. When people made mistakes, people could die. She started a blog called Underground Truths, where she posted detailed troubleshooting guides, answered questions, and highlighted both successful builds and failures, with lessons learned from each. She was brutally honest about the risks. This is not a weekend project, she wrote in one post. This is a serious construction undertaking that requires proper planning, the right materials, and attention to detail. Cut corners on the insulation, and you'll freeze. Mess up the ventilation, and you'll suffocate. Ignore the vapor barrier, and you'll grow mold. Please take this seriously. She created a certification program, free but rigorous. Anyone who completed her online course and passed a comprehensive exam received a certificate confirming they understood the critical safety elements. It wasn't legally binding, but it gave builders confidence and gave Sarah peace of mind. One email stood out. It came from a woman named Maria Gonzalez in northern Minnesota. Dear Sarah, I'm a single mother with 2 kids, ages 7 and 9. Last winter, we nearly froze when our furnace died, and we couldn't afford repairs. I've been saving money for 6 months. I think I have enough to build your shelter, but I'm scared I'll mess it up. I've never done construction before. Can you help? Sarah stared at the email for a long time. She thought about all the consultations she'd been offered, universities, engineering firms, even a reality TV show. She turned them all down because they felt like distractions from what mattered. But this was exactly what mattered. She typed her reply. Maria, I'll do better than help. I'll come build it with you. Let me teach you how to do it right. Sarah arrived in Maria's town, a small mining community called Eveleth, in early June. Maria lived in a modest house on 2 acres, just enough space for a shelter. Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah taught Maria everything. Not just how to build a shelter, but why each element mattered. They started with site selection, using soil samples to confirm they were below the frost line and above the water table. The earth is your foundation, Sarah explained, digging into the Minnesota clay. You need to understand what you're building into. This clay is good. It's stable and has decent thermal mass. Sandy soil would drain better, but hold less heat. You need to know your ground. They rented a small excavator, and Sarah taught Maria how to operate it. The first day, Maria was terrified. By the third day, she was confidently digging precise contours for the shelter floor. You're a natural, Sarah said. I'm terrified I'm going to screw this up, Maria admitted. My kids' lives could depend on this. Then we'll build it right. Fear is good. It keeps you careful. Overconfidence is what causes mistakes. They worked methodically. Forms for the concrete walls. Rebar placement for structural integrity. The concrete pour. They hired that out because it required a truck and professional crew, But Sarah made sure Maria understood every specification. While the concrete cured, they fabricated the insulation system. Sarah showed Maria how to mix the lime perlite blend, how to create the air gap between walls, how to install it so moisture could escape, but heat couldn't. Maria's kids helped when they could, hauling buckets and learning alongside their mother. 7-year-old Diego became fascinated with the geothermal loops. 9-year-old Carmen documented everything with her tablet, creating a video diary of the build. "Why does the water get warm underground, Miss Sarah?" Diego asked. Sarah knelt down to his level. "The Earth's core is incredibly hot, like a giant furnace at the center of the planet. That heat slowly migrates outward. By the time it reaches 8 or 10 feet down, it's not hot anymore, but it's warm, about 52 degrees. We're just borrowing that warmth. And we get it back." Exactly. We're not taking anything from the Earth. We're just using what's already there. The build took 6 weeks. Sarah had originally planned to stay for 3, but she couldn't leave until it was perfect. She taught Maria electrical basics for the LED lighting system. She showed her how to test the ventilation for proper airflow. She helped her set up the thermal mass barrels and explained the heat storage calculations. On the final day, they stood in the completed shelter together. The temperature read 54 degrees Fahrenheit, ambient Earth temperature, exactly what it should be before the thermal systems kicked in. "You did this," Sarah said. "When winter comes, when the next storm hits, you and your kids will be safe. Not because I built this for you, but because you built it yourself. You'll know every inch of the shelter, how to maintain it, how to troubleshoot problems. That knowledge is worth more than the shelter itself." Maria's eyes were wet. "How can I ever thank you?" Sarah smiled. "Build it right. Survive. And if someone else needs help someday, teach them like I taught you. That's how we thank each other." Before Sarah left, young Carmen showed her the video diary she'd created. It was remarkably well done. Clear explanations, good camera work, step-by-step documentation of the entire build. "Can I post this online?" Carmen asked. "So other kids can see how we did it?" Sarah looked at Maria, who nodded. "Post it," Sarah said. "You might inspire someone." Carmen's video went viral. Within a month, it had been viewed over 2 million times. Schools started using it in science classes. DIY channels featured it. The comment section filled with people sharing their own shelter builds, their own preparations, their own stories of survival. Sarah watched from Montana, amazed at what she'd started. She'd built a shelter to save herself. Now that shelter, that idea, that knowledge was spreading across the world, saving others. November came again, and with it, another warning. Not as severe as the previous year's historic blizzard, but serious enough. A major winter storm system moving down from Canada, expected to bring heavy snow and dangerous cold to the northern plains. Sarah was ready. She'd spent the fall making improvements to her shelter based on Dr. Webb's recommendations. The new airlock system at the entrance. The heat recovery ventilator. Additional thermal mass. She'd even installed a small aquaponic system. Fish tanks that provided both protein and additional thermal mass, with plants growing under LED lights. But she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about Maria and her kids. About Tom Rivera and his family in Billings. About the dozens of people who'd built shelters based on her plans. She sent out an email through her blog network. "Storm coming. If you build a shelter, now's the time to test it. Stock supplies, check systems, be ready. Report back after the storm. I want to hear how they perform." The storm hit on a Tuesday night. Sarah descended into her improved shelter with Rex and a sense of calm confidence. She knew what to expect now. She knew the sounds the earth made when snow piled up above. She knew how quickly the temperature would stabilize, how the thermal mass would charge and discharge. She spent the 3-day storm reading, exercising, cooking simple meals, and monitoring her instruments. The shelter held at 83 degrees Fahrenheit this time. She dialed back the thermal mass slightly after realizing she'd actually been too warm the previous year. But while she waited out the storm in comfort, she thought about the bigger picture. Across Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, Minnesota, dozens of families were in their own shelters now. Families who would have been in danger, who might have faced freezing homes and impossible choices. When the storm passed and Sarah emerged, her inbox was full. Maria, we made it. 82 degrees for 3 days. Kids thought it was an adventure. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it. Tom Rivera, shelter performed perfectly. Family of 5 plus our dog stayed comfortable the whole time. My wife said it was the best camping trip she's ever had. A woman from North Dakota, power was out for 4 days. House got down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. We moved into the shelter on day 2. Stayed warm, stayed safe. You saved my family. Message after message. Success after success. A few problems reported, a ventilation intake that needed adjustment, a thermal mass barrel that had leaked, but no disasters, no failures, no tragedies. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, reading through them all, and felt something she hadn't expected: pride. Not in herself, exactly, but in what collective knowledge could accomplish. She'd learned from her great-grandmother's journals. She'd studied ancient building techniques. She'd applied modern thermal science. And now she'd taught others, who were teaching others still. The knowledge was spreading like warmth through the earth itself, slowly, steadily, reliably. Dr. Webb called that evening. Sarah, I've been compiling the data from the shelter network. Over 50 occupied shelters during this storm, all performing within expected parameters. Do you understand what you've created? Not just a shelter design, but a survival network. A community of people who know how to protect themselves when systems fail. It's just basic physics, Sarah said. No, Dr. Webb replied firmly. It's applied wisdom. There's a difference. Physics is understanding that the Earth maintains a constant temperature below the frost line. Wisdom is knowing how to use that fact to save lives. You've given people both. That night, Sarah returned to her shelter one more time, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. She sat in the quiet space 12 feet below ground, feeling the Earth's constant warmth around her, and thought about resilience. The world above was getting more unpredictable: storms, heat waves, infrastructure failures. But here, surrounded by earth and stone and carefully calculated thermal mass, there was stability. There was safety. There was proof that humans could still build things that worked with nature instead of fighting against it. She pulled out her notebook and started sketching. She had an idea for a greenhouse attachment that could extend the growing season year-round. Another idea for a community-scale shelter that could house an entire neighborhood. The blizzard had tested her. She'd passed. But the test wasn't over. It was just beginning. And Sarah Chen was ready for whatever came next. By the spring of the following year, what had started as one woman's survival project had become something much larger. Sarah's shelter design had been featured in engineering journals, survival magazines, and even mainstream architecture publications. But more importantly, it had been built. Over 200 documented installations across North America, with countless more unreported. The movement had taken on a life of its own. Online forums buzzed with builders sharing modifications and improvements. A community emerged around the principles Sarah had championed, working with nature, not against it. In April, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The International Sustainable Building Conference in Denver wanted her as a keynote speaker. They offered to pay her travel expenses and a speaking fee that made her eyes widen. I'm not a public speaker, she told the organizer over the phone. You don't need to be, came the reply. You just need to tell your story. People need to hear it from you. The person who actually did it, who bet her life on the design and survived. Sarah accepted, mostly because she saw it as an opportunity to share the knowledge even more widely. But as she prepared her presentation in the weeks leading up to the conference, she realized she had more to say than she'd thought. The conference center in Denver was enormous, filled with architects, engineers, sustainability advocates, and policymakers from around the world. Sarah felt out of place in her simple flannel shirt and jeans among the suits and designer outfits. But when she took the stage, something shifted. She began with a photo of her great-grandmother's journal entry from 1949, third day without heat. Children wrapped in every blanket we own. I pray this cold breaks soon. That's why I built my shelter, Sarah said simply. Not because I'm a prepper or a survivalist or paranoid. Because I learned from history that people freeze when systems fail. And I decided that wouldn't be me. She walked the audience through her design, explaining each element in clear, practical terms. No jargon, no technical showboating, just honest explanation of what worked and why. She showed her temperature logs from the historic blizzard, the thermal imaging scans, the data Dr. Webb had collected. But then she showed something else, photos from the builder's network. Maria and her children standing proudly in front of their completed shelter. Tom Rivera's family giving thumbs up from inside theirs. The Alaska community shelter that had housed an entire village during a power outage. This isn't about my shelter anymore, Sarah said. It's about a principle that we can build resilience into our lives using simple, proven methods. The Earth has been here for billions of years, maintaining its temperature through ice ages and heat waves. We just need to be smart enough to use what it offers. The applause was thunderous. After her talk, she was mobbed with questions, requests for interviews, proposals for partnerships. An architect from Norway wanted to incorporate her principles into affordable housing. A disaster relief organization wanted to deploy portable versions in refugee camps. A university wanted to offer her an honorary degree. Sarah politely declined most of it, but she said yes to one thing: a collaboration with a nonprofit that built housing in underserved communities. They wanted to integrate underground thermal shelters into their projects, giving families both homes and safety. That, Sarah told them, is exactly what this should be used for. Not everyone was a fan of Sarah's work. As the shelter design gained prominence, critics emerged. A building inspector in Wyoming condemned several shelters as non-compliant with residential codes, claiming they lacked proper permits and didn't meet safety standards. A viral blog post titled "The Underground Shelter Scam" accused Sarah of promoting dangerous DIY construction that could get people killed. The most serious challenge came from an engineering firm that claimed Sarah's design infringed on their patented geothermal heating system. They sent a cease and desist letter demanding she stop distributing her plans and pay licensing fees for existing builds. Sarah was devastated. She'd made her plans open source specifically to avoid this kind of profiteering. But now she faced potential legal action that could shut down everything she'd built. Dr. Webb connected her with a law professor at Montana State who specialized in patent law. After reviewing the case, the professor smiled. "They don't have a case," he said. "Your design uses principles that are hundreds of years old: earth-sheltered housing, passive geothermal, thermal mass storage. You can't patent physics. You can't patent techniques that predate modern intellectual property law. Their patent is specific to an active mechanical system. Yours is passive. They're different enough that no court would uphold their claim." Sarah wrote a detailed response, with Dr. Webb's research backing her up, and the firm quietly dropped the matter. But the experience shook her. She'd never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted to fight legal battles or defend her work against attacks. "This is what happens when something becomes successful," Dr. Webb told her over coffee. "People want to control it, monetize it, or tear it down. You have to decide, is the mission worth the fight?" Sarah thought about Maria's kids, safe in their shelter during the storm. She thought about the Alaska village that had stayed warm when their generator failed. She thought about her great-grandmother writing in her journal by candlelight, praying for the cold to break. "Yes," she said, "it's worth it." She doubled down. She made her plans even more detailed and accessible, creating video tutorials for every step of construction. She started a nonprofit foundation to provide grants for low-income families who wanted to build shelters but couldn't afford materials. She partnered with community colleges to offer hands-on workshops teaching the construction techniques. And when building inspectors challenged the safety of the shelters, she worked with them instead of fighting them. She helped draft model codes that would allow earth-sheltered structures while maintaining legitimate safety standards. She demonstrated that her designs met or exceeded requirements for structural integrity, fire safety, and air quality. Slowly, the opposition faded, not because Sarah had fought battles, but because she'd proven the value of her work through results. Hundreds of families were safer. Energy consumption was reduced. Communities were more resilient. The data didn't lie. 2 years after the historic blizzard, Sarah stood in what she called Shelter 3.0, her latest iteration of the design, built on a new section of her property. This version incorporated everything she'd learned. The thermal performance was even better, maintaining 85 degrees Fahrenheit with less supplemental heating. The living space was larger but used less material through improved structural design. And she'd added innovations that went beyond just survival. The aquaponics system had evolved into a full, closed-loop food production setup. Fish tanks provided protein and fertilizer for vegetables growing under LED lights powered by solar panels. The system produced more food than Sarah could eat. She'd started donating fresh vegetables to the local food bank. She'd integrated rainwater collection and filtration, making the shelter completely water independent. She'd added a composting toilet system that required no external sewage connection. The shelter could sustain one person indefinitely or a family for months. But the most significant evolution wasn't technical. It was philosophical. Sarah had started thinking beyond emergency survival to everyday sustainability. Why should these principles only apply during disasters? Why not live this way all the time? She'd begun spending more nights in the shelter than in her house, not because she had to, but because she preferred it. The constant temperature meant no energy wasted on heating or cooling. The quiet meant better sleep. The simplicity meant less distraction. "I think I've been building this backwards," she told Dr. Webb during one of his regular visits. "I designed it as emergency backup for a conventional house. But what if the shelter is actually the better way to live, and the conventional house is the backup?" Dr. Webb nodded thoughtfully. "There's a growing movement toward that kind of thinking. Earth-integrated housing, radical efficiency, living lightly on the land. You're not alone in this." He showed her examples from around the world. The F-ship community in New Mexico, building homes from recycled materials with complete sustainability. The underground Cobra PDE homes in Australia, where entire communities live below ground to escape extreme heat. Modern passive house designs in Germany that used minimal energy for maximum comfort. "You've contributed something important to this conversation," Dr. Webb said. "You've proven that these principles work in the most extreme conditions. If a shelter can keep you warm in a -40 blizzard using just earth and physics, imagine what it could do in normal conditions." Sarah started designing her next project, a full Earth-integrated home that combined the shelter's thermal efficiency with the amenities of modern living. Natural light from strategically placed skylights and light tubes. A living roof that provided insulation and garden space. Radiant floor heating powered by the same passive geothermal system. It would be beautiful and sustainable and provable. A demonstration that you didn't have to choose between comfort and environmental responsibility. She was sketching the plans when her phone rang. It was Maria. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this. The tribal council on the reservation contacted me. They want to build community shelters for all 7 villages in the region, and they want us to teach them how to do it. They're offering to pay for our time and expertise." Sarah felt a surge of excitement. This was the dream. Indigenous communities reclaiming ancient wisdom, combining it with modern understanding, building true resilience. "When do we start?" she asked. The reservation project took 8 months. Sarah and Maria traveled to each village, working alongside community members to build shelters adapted to local conditions and cultural needs. The tribal elders shared knowledge about traditional earth lodges, and Sarah showed how to integrate those principles with modern thermal science. The shelters became more than emergency backup. They became community centers, gathering spaces, living classrooms where elders could teach traditional knowledge to younger generations. Each village painted their shelter with traditional designs, transforming them from purely functional structures into cultural landmarks. One evening, sitting around a fire with the elders of the Red Sky Village, Sarah heard a story that moved her deeply. An elder named Joseph Whitehorse spoke about his grandmother who had lived through the winters of the early 1900s. "She always said the earth was our first mother, providing everything we needed," he said. "We build our lodges into the ground not because we were primitive, but because we understood what you're teaching now. The Earth protects, the Earth provides warmth, the Earth is constant when everything else changes. He looked at Sarah with wise, weathered eyes. What you've done isn't new. You've remembered. And in remembering, you've given us permission to remember too, to value what our ancestors knew. That's the real gift. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She thought she was teaching. She hadn't realized she was also learning, that her great-grandmother's journals, her research into ancient techniques, her entire journey had been about reconnecting with knowledge that had never truly been lost, just forgotten. By the time the reservation project was complete, Sarah had trained 23 people in shelter construction. Those 23 went on to train others. The knowledge rippled outward like heat through thermal mass, slowly, steadily, warming everything it touched. Back in Montana, Sarah received word that her work had been nominated for a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant. She laughed when she read the nomination letter. Genius? She just dug a hole and paid attention to physics. She didn't win, but something better happened. A teacher in rural Alaska wrote to tell her that her shelter design was now part of the 8th grade science curriculum, with students building scale models to understand thermodynamics. A family in northern Canada sent photos of their 3-generation household, grandparents, parents, and children, all safe and warm in their shelter during a brutal cold snap. Dr. Webb published their research paper in the Journal of Sustainable Architecture. It became one of the most cited papers in the field. Universities incorporated the design into their engineering programs. Nonprofits distributed the plans internationally. 3 years after the historic blizzard, Sarah returned to the cemetery where her great-grandmother was buried. She stood at the weathered headstone and placed a hand on the cold stone. "I read your journals," she said quietly. "I learned from what you survived, and I passed it on, just like you passed it to me through those pages. Thank you for writing it down. Thank you for remembering." The wind rustled through the Montana pines. Snow clung to the branches, but spring was coming. The cycle continued. 5 years after building her first shelter, Sarah stood on her property at dawn, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Her land had transformed into a living laboratory of sustainable design. Shelter 3.0 had become her primary residence. She converted her grandfather's cabin into a workshop and guest space. The property now included demonstration gardens, a small wind turbine, expanded solar arrays, and a greenhouse that grew food year-round using waste heat from composting. But the most significant development was the dozen people camped on her property, students from around the world who'd come for her annual underground building intensive, a month-long hands-on course in earth-integrated construction. They came from Japan, Norway, Kenya, Brazil, Chile, learning not just how to build, but why it mattered. Sarah taught them the same way she'd learned, by doing. They dug, poured concrete, installed insulation, tested systems. They made mistakes and learned from them. They got dirty and tired and frustrated and triumphant. On the final day of the course, after they'd completed a demonstration shelter from start to finish, Sarah gathered them around a campfire. "When I built my first shelter, I was just trying to survive a winter," she told them. "I never imagined it would become this, a movement, a methodology, a community. But that's how real change happens. Someone solves a problem for themselves, shares what they learned, and suddenly others are solving their own problems in their own ways." She looked around the circle at faces from 6 continents, all united by a common understanding. That resilience came from working with nature, not against it. "You're going home to different climates, different cultures, different challenges," she continued. "Don't just copy what I did. Adapt it, improve it, make it yours, and then teach someone else. That's how knowledge stays alive, by constantly being reborn in new contexts." A student from Kenya named Amara spoke up. "In my village, we face extreme heat, not cold. But the principles are the same, yes? The Earth's constant temperature, the thermal mass, the insulation. We just invert the problem." "Exactly," Sarah said, smiling. "You're already thinking like a designer. What keeps heat in during winter keeps heat out during summer. The Earth doesn't care about our problems. It just offers its constant temperature. We decide how to use it. After the course ended and the students departed, Sarah found herself alone again with Rex, now graying around the muzzle, but still loyal. They descended into the shelter together, into the quiet, constant warmth. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began writing. Not plans this time, but a book. A comprehensive guide to Earth-integrated building for extreme climates, combining her practical experience with Dr. Webb's scientific analysis and the cultural wisdom she'd learned from the tribal elders. She wanted to document everything while the knowledge was fresh, while she could still remember every mistake and success, every calculation and instinct. The book would be her legacy, not just the technical how-to, but the philosophical why. Why we'd forgotten these principles in the first place, in our rush toward fossil-fueled climate control. Why we needed to remember them now, as climate instability made extreme weather more common. Why the solution to modern problems sometimes lay in ancient wisdom, updated with modern understanding. She wrote late into the night, as she'd done so many times before, surrounded by the thermal mass that kept her warm, the earth that held her safe, the silence that let her think. Outside, the Montana winter had settled in again. Not as severe as the historic blizzard, but cold enough. Snow fell steadily, accumulating on the surface. 12 feet below, Sarah's thermometer read 85 degrees Fahrenheit. She smiled, saved her work, and settled in for the night. Tomorrow she'd write more. Tomorrow she'd answer the emails from people building shelters in Nepal, and Siberia, and Patagonia. Tomorrow she'd continue the work. But tonight, she simply appreciated what she'd built. Not just a shelter, but a proof of concept. Evidence that humans could still solve problems with intelligence, observation, and respect for natural systems. That we could be both modern and sustainable, comfortable and responsible, individual and connected. The blizzard that had tested her 5 years ago had become the catalyst for something larger than survival. It had sparked a remembering, a reconnection with knowledge that had been there all along, waiting in the earth itself. Sarah turned off her LED light and laid down in the darkness, listening to the silence of the earth around her. Somewhere above, snow continued to fall. But here, in this carefully crafted space between the surface and the depths, temperature remained constant. 85 degrees. Perfect. Provable. Permanent. And the knowledge of how to achieve it was now spreading across the world, shelter by shelter, builder by builder, one warm refuge at a time.